that I'll jump into really quick. And Bruce can't be with us. He had a schedule conflict. I think there's a field hockey game tonight. The CTE schools in Maine and the high schools that they work with as their sending schools have a new law that's going to be in effect by 2025, where the regions need to look at how credit is provided for students who are taking classes through their CTE schools. So today I got together with our Maine Curriculum Leader Association director and another MCLA board member in Augusta, and the three of us started looking at the framework of all of the language of the industry standards for the CTE schools, and then the Maine learning results standards, and working on some crosswalk documents. It's not a brand new project. Some of that work has already been done in the past, but we're trying to compile all of it so that we have some documentation moving forward that the state can use as a framework, so that we can make sure that students are receiving credits for the work that they're doing at schools like the Midcoast School of Technology. So that's a little pathways update.
Good.
The bulk of what I'm going to share today is sort of like an addendum to what I shared with you last time. I went over some of the NUIA data results with you, and I know that they looked a little bit discouraging. I'm going to share an update with you because at the time, I didn't have any data through the Maine Through Your dashboard. I just had the RIT scores from the NUIA assessment, which is what we typically would use when we're doing comparison. I also shared with you that I didn't feel like we were comparing apples to apples because the assessment was different in the spring than the normal NUIA assessment that we take, because Maine is now using this through year assessment, which has questions that are leveled more closely to grade level. So the data that I'm going to show you right now doesn't look quite as concerning as it initially looked, where we saw some of those big drop-offs in scores, and part of that is because Maine has developed a scaled score model. So they're using the scaled score as opposed to just having districts rely on the RIT scores. So I will show you what that data looks like so that you can see a comparison to state expectations. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right. And do you guys see Maine Department of Education at the top of my screen? Okay, perfect. So right now we're viewing all of our third grades across the district. So there's 4 schools. This represents our 4 elementary schools. It shows you the median scaled score across all of those schools. And we're looking at math. And you can actually see that based on the scaled score, so we looked at that data and it looked kind of scary. But I think the big question is, how are we doing in comparison with Maine? Like, are we totally low? Is there a problem? And this is how we scored in comparison with the rest of the state on third grade math. So all of our schools were in the green, meeting state expectation. Now we were on the lower end of the green. 1510 was our scaled score. And we can dig into this a little further. But we can see this data here certainly looks much better than what we were looking at initially. Especially Cushing had some excellent data here with where the majority of their students were scoring either at or above state expectation. So the green is at state expectation, the blue is above state expectation. Also exciting, Thomaston Grammar School had 0 students that were well below state expectation. So that's definitely some data to be proud of. I'm going to click through these grade levels just so that you can see, again, this is 4th grade math. All 4 of our schools were meeting state expectations. Fifth grade math, this is the group. These are our current sixth graders that we were the most and continue to be the most concerned about. They are the most affected academically by COVID based on our data, but national data is showing a very similar trend. We have 2 schools that the fifth grade was below state expectation and 2 schools where the fifth grade was at state expectation. The 2 schools that had fifth grades that were below state expectation were Ash Point Community School and South School. And then the 2 that were above, Thomaston Grammar School and Cushing. Sixth grade, the trend sort of goes on from here. Again, I don't find this data completely surprising because in the middle school, we're in the midst of new program implementation. So middle school is below state expectation, not by much. You can see our scaled score is 1499, so we're right on the cusp. We're working on our continued implementation of our new program this year. I'm going to be meeting with math teachers and talking about their beginning of the year diagnostic assessments, what their instruction in their classroom looks like, how we can make sure that students are receiving appropriate interventions. So we've got a process that's going to be up and running for that piece, and hopefully that will help to nose us over the edge there, especially with that sixth grade group. Seventh grade as well, though, again, scaled score 1496. We're close to being at state expectation as a whole school, but currently we are below. And same with grade 8, currently below state expectation with a scaled score of 1492. So not super low, but still concerning, and certainly still an area that we're continuing to work on to address the math piece. High school took the assessment as well. The state is still saying that they have some concerns about how the high school data turned out based on the through-year assessment. So they don't feel like these scores are totally reliable. We're not too far below state expectation here, but I'll take you back to our cohort data in just a moment and just give you an example again of how our RIT scores were so different from the data that we got back from this assessment. So I'll take you back there in just a moment. Math overall was a bit lower than reading. I'll work backwards from reading. Our reading data for the high school was at state expectation. Again, this is based on the scaled score. I'm going to show you that high school data and show you just a couple of the funky things that we're still trying to get clarity from the Maine Department of Ed. I actually met with them last Thursday during an administration training where they were talking a little bit more about the scores. It sounds to me like the Maine Department of Ed is still working on getting clarity and some level of accountability from the people that work on the NUIA assessment. So we're sort of waiting on a chain of information and for a couple of kinks to still be worked out. Grade 8, this is the reading test at state expectation. Grade 7, at state expectation, just a hair over. Grade 6 was at state expectation. Grade 5 was at state expectation as a whole, all 4 of our schools. Grade 4 had 1 school that was not at state expectation, the other 3 were. This group is kind of interesting. We've been watching this group all along as well. This is our current 5th grade in Cushing. This group has always been interesting and gotten some additional attention and support. This data actually looks better than it has in the past. It has been continuing to improve over time. These kids were in kindergarten and halfway through the year, they had a replacement of a teacher. So there was a little bit of lag time in there with a long-term sub and then a replacement teacher who was new to teaching the curriculum. Their beginning of their 1st grade year, they had a teacher on maternity leave, so a long-term sub. The ending of their 1st grade year was the beginning of COVID and emergency learning. And then, of course, you know, the COVID year, their 2nd grade year. There weren't a ton of interruptions to our elementary schools because there was no hybrid learning, but just the process of kids having to be out because they were symptomatic or so forth and so on. We know that attendance did become really problematic for kids as well. So that's 4th grade, and then 3rd grade, this was the last group tested. Let me just finish my thought real quick. So everybody in 4th grade, or sorry, all of the 4 schools were at state expectations for 4th grade. All right, yes, go ahead, Lauren.
So like the last slide, just as an example, 11 students completed it. Does that mean there were 11 students in the class, or like 4 students didn't take it? And if they, like in every one of our examples, if there are a number who don't, do you think it's just random as opposed to they were less likely to do the assessments for some reason that if they took it would skew the test one way or another? See what I mean? Like how many are we missing, and does it have any meaning to the data, or like, nah, it doesn't have any meaning to the data?
In this school, it was 11 of 11 students that took the assessment.
Okay.
So there weren't any missing scores here.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I was just wondering, like overall, in the different grades and the different assessments, if who takes them matters in terms of what the ultimate scoring is as an average, but maybe hard to say.
I can tell you. Let's look at grade 8. 103 of 119. So we did have some that were missing here. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a minute, just so I can see all of you. Oh, there we go. I just had to pop you out to a different window. It does affect us negatively when kids do not take the assessment. It will pull our overall score down. I don't know the exact mechanism that they use, but I know that it does. It's not like they all count as zeros, but it does factor in against the overall average of the school. Mm-hmm. Some of the reasons that kids would have missed the assessment, attendance was one of the reasons. Yeah. Extended illness. We did have a couple of kids with an extended illness. And then the other reason was refusal. And I had a couple of those kids last year, just, a complete refusal, or it would result in a behavior issue. That certainly, it was eye-opening to me how impactful that assessment can be on how a student's day goes. But I have one quick little piece to report about that. This year, I visited the middle school program on Friday, and the kids all told me that they just took the NUIA assessment and that they really took it seriously. And I was like, you're kidding me. And they wanted to know their scores. So I happened to have my laptop with me, and I sat with each of them and talked about how long they took on the assessment. All of them had a high level of engagement in both literacy and the math assessment, and we talked about what their scores meant. It was a pretty neat transformation.
That's really great. That's very telling and really great. Yep.
Yeah, Lauren, to your question, maybe this is another way to look at it. I think if students are if there's truancy, or if they're less likely to be at school, probably there's correlation between that and lower test scores, I would imagine. I don't have any data to back that up, but I would assume that if kids are regularly attending schools, then their test scores would probably suffer as a result.
Yep.
And I will show you one other thing that I wanted to just circle back to, especially with the high school data. So this looked extremely concerning when we compared these RIT scores, but again, the tests are not the same, regardless of what NUIA was suggesting at first, that there would be no difference in those RIT scores. They're actually now saying that the RIT scores across the nation were lower on average. That actually tells me that there's an issue with the instrument that you're using, not the cohorts that you're teaching, because this would be completely out of the norm to see a dip that drastic when that hasn't been the trend. The scaled score that Maine is using, you saw that for literacy, the school as a whole for literacy was at state expectation. So their scaled score is much more on par with what we've been seeing, maybe like a very slight dip. Scaled score for math still shows a fairly significant dip. So that would still be alarming. But again, I'm not putting a ton of stock into those high school scores because I haven't gotten a lot of clarity from the state, and they've advised that there have been some issues there with the high school scores. You'll also notice there are no scaled scores here because our 9th graders took the assessment, but they took the original NUIA growth. So did our 2nd graders. And you'll notice their scores are much more consistent and even slightly improved than what we're seeing from our students that took the actual main MEA through year assessment. So I think it's very clear to me that there's a difference in these two assessments. I think NUIA hasn't quite admitted that piece yet, but we're still getting more clarity on, what should we be seeing from this data and how can we understand it. I think going forward, and I asked this on Thursday, I asked, can we compare our data now fall to fall and spring to spring? And it sounds like we need to wait and see what that data looks like, but it's probably going to be a viable option to analyze our data that way, as opposed to trying to look at it all as one ongoing trend.
Stephanie, do you have a sense of what Maine expectations are relative to other states? I mean, I'm just sort of curious how they define expectations for achievement in math or reading or what have you.
Yeah, they have an interesting process. They actually invite content area specialists from across the state to go to Augusta. We had somebody from our middle school attend for the math, and I could ask her for even more details, but from what she told me in August, in July, the group got together, looked at the assessment, looked at the data that was coming in, did some sample questions to analyze the level at which students were providing some of their answers, because some of these are open-ended answers. Not all of them were multiple choice answers. And they evaluated answers based on rubrics. And enough of them were doing that so that they could sort of find the median of how to score those student answers using that rubric.
But we don't know if Maine's expectations are different significantly than other New England states or other states across the country.
Maine's expectations are going to be slightly different in reading and literacy because Maine has changed the learning results for the Common Core. They used to be the Common Core. Now they've shifted. Again, their process is they get a group together and they develop the language and there's a feedback process, but it's really driven by people within Maine as opposed to sort of these more national level standards. So it's going to depend on what the standards are. Right.
And that varies from state to state. So we don't really, it's apples to oranges if we were to compare ourselves to, let's say, Massachusetts, which has some of the better public schools in the country, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that was the nice thing about the NUIA data, because the NUIA data, the RIT score was normed across the nation. Right now, that through-year assessment is not normed across the entire nation. That's why we're seeing such funky RIT scores from the summer. But otherwise, when it was normed across the nation, we could use that and look at the standard deviation of our students and determine the percentage of our students that were at and above proficiency levels. We really can't do that right now with the current assessment. And we really can't compare our data at the state level to other states. That's a pro of national standards, by the way. We've been having that conversation a lot lately because another topic that we're going to talk briefly about today is we're working on our curriculum. And last year we realigned our curriculum to the new Maine learning results. But some of the main learning results for things like music and health PE, when it's just Maine-based language developed by and for Maine, but we're such a small state, we don't have curriculum resource companies that are making materials just for our learning results. So it becomes really challenging if you're not using national standards.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions about the NUIA data?
Nope. Nope. Thank you. Thank you very much for all that explanation. Thank you.
You're welcome. I am still learning as well because things have shifted. So
Well, do you think like, oh, there's a question. Do you think NUIA will adjust their tools, evaluation tools over time with more feedback and information like you're talking about?
I know that Maine has done a lot of coordination with NUIA, but the other thing that has shifted is NUIA was recently purchased by Houghton Mifflin. So some things that shift that, you know, Maine doesn't have any control over that. Maine made the agreement before there was a shift. So, you know, I don't know. I feel like there are a lot of things that are well out of our control in that assessment piece. And I rely very heavily on those who are in control in Augusta, but it also feels like there are things that are happening that's out of their control as well. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see. The next thing I wanted to show you is Carol had asked about writing and where we are with writing. I mentioned to you that we're going to be looking at our curriculum materials, and part of that also includes revisiting our rubrics and doing revisions of our rubrics. So I'm going to show you where all of that is on our website. And while I'm doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work that's on the horizon as well that teachers will be starting on Wednesday of this week. So let me pull up the RSU13 webpage, maybe. I have too much on my screen. Are you guys seeing the RSU13 webpage?
Just the top.
Just the top. All right, give me just a second. Oh, there it is. Okay. Now are you seeing the whole thing?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
Great. All right, so from the RSU13 webpage on the curriculum tab, there is a tab that says teacher resources. And as you scroll down under the English section here, you will see all of the writing rubrics. So starting in grade K, we've even teased out the writing specific rubrics just so that they're super easily accessible. The elementary ones are broken up by some of the types of writing. So narrative writing is, let's see. Give me just a minute. I don't know why. That looked like only trimester 1 writing. It is. So for some reason, trimester 2 and 3 isn't linked in there. So I'm going to have to fix that. But I'll start with grade 1. They have their, you'll see all 3 types here. Narrative writing, trimester 1, similar to grade K, but their skills are sort of up to the next grade level. Informative writing, trimester 2, and then opinion writing, trimester 3. So all of the grade K through 5 rubrics follow the same pattern of they all have narrative writing, they all have informational writing, and they all have opinion writing. So I won't show you all of them, but just know that all of those rubrics are here. I'll jump to the 5th grade one. You can just see that they get more complex Some of the look-fors increase and the focus areas that we want to provide students feedback on, increase in the complexity level, using technology to publish their writing is added in there by the time they get to, I think, 3rd grade actually, but it carries on through 5th grade as well. The language usage pieces within the writing increases from every grade level as well. Opinion writing, and then of course the informative and explanatory writing. And by the time they get to some of this informative and explanatory writing, starting in 3rd grade again, I believe they're also starting to gather information from sources. So they're learning how to cite their sources and be able to provide some of those like shorter bibliographies, more kind of in a structured and supported way. And grade 6. Their writing, they have 1, 2, 3, 4 writing rubrics here. The writing arguments links to that opinion writing. The writing research links to supporting writing informative and writing arguments. You might have research that connects to either of those. The writing process really connects to all of the types of writings. It's doing the drafting process, the editing, the revising. And then this one also includes the writing narratives. So it's kind of 2 types of rubrics within one space here. And by the time students are in middle school, these teachers they're probably not going to assign they're not going to provide an assignment that's both a narrative and an informative. So they're not going to print off this whole rubric for an essay and be looking for all of these things at once. Whereas in 1st grade for an opinion piece, those teachers can just print off that rubric, attach it to the paper, and that's what they're looking for in the pieces that the students are submitting. Once students get to 6th grade through high school, teachers can use this language and copy it and paste it into their own document to create rubrics that match up with the instruction that they're providing in their class. So for example, if they are doing an informative piece, so writing informational text, they might include developing the topic with relevant facts, definitions, concrete details, quotations. They might include this language, and then they might also include language from the writing process. They probably would take some of this language here as well. They want to see evidence of planning, revising, editing, rewriting, trying a new approach. They might want to see demonstration of grade appropriate conventions in their writing. So they're really able to use these rubrics as their sort of like their go-to resource, and they can pull their own rubric language from this language that's shared by all teachers in that grade level. So then you don't have one 6th grade teacher is using these look-fors, the other 6th grade teacher is looking for something completely different. Gets even more complicated by the time you get to the high school. You don't want your teachers all looking for something different. You want them all pulling from the same language. You will probably hear that we used to do a writing prompt across the district. We no longer do that writing prompt because we have common rubrics and common expectations. I'll just pull up the 9-12 ones. These are very similar to the 6 through 8 ones. You'll just see there's a writing arguments, writing informational text, writing process, and writing research. Same titles and same headings. The complexity just gets a little more challenging by the time you get to the high school level. But part of why we no longer do the writing prompt was what we used to call it, is it's a really time-consuming process for a one-time piece. Instead, what we really want to see is that we have common expectations that we can use throughout the school year, and we're all agreeing on what we want to look for in that rubric language. When we used to do the writing prompt, we used to score in 4 different areas. And that was great because we were all consistent in those areas. But the downside was it was kind of like a high stakes assessment that you're just doing once. So instead of that kind of an approach, we want to make sure that we're consistent all the time. And that's by sharing that rubric language. So one of the things that the content area groups will be doing starting this Wednesday is going back to that rubric language. You probably saw things that were highlighted on there or things that said new language. They need to go back to that and make some adjustments to that language so that everything matches up to what the standards are. Some of those standards have adjusted, and the groups have not gotten together to make adjustments to their rubrics since pre-COVID. That was when we used to pull teachers out, and we did the work when we had plenty of subs available. And it's just not realistic for us to do that anymore. So the framework that I came up with that I shared with you guys at the end of last year, let me actually pop it up on my screen as well. This is sort of the brainstorm of how we're going to approach our curriculum work as we're going forward. And it's basically a 3-year rotation so that groups will have time to get together. Multi-grade, hold on. I can't multitask right now. Multi-year, here we go. During our early release days for October and January, we're going to have our grades 6 through 12 teachers who are our content area specialists. They're going to get together for almost 2.5 hours. Our K through 5 teachers are going to get together for almost 2.5 hours. And they will know that every year going forward, they will always have 2 set early release days that they can depend on to meet together with either their grade level in K5 or their content area in grades 6 through 12 to reconnect and do some of this work. Every 3 years, they will have an additional 4 meeting times that will be paid work beyond contract. So that every 3-year rotation, when their group is prioritized, they'll have 6 meetings during the school year to really focus on accomplishing some higher level work that needs to get done. So for example, this year, the prioritized groups are grade K and 1. We established our I-CAN statements. We wrote all of our rubrics about 6 years ago. We've made little adjustments along the way, but we're at a point where we really need to start reviewing this work and seeing what other adjustments might need to be made. Especially in the area of literacy, where some of the rubric language that we came up with was a best practice at the time, but some of the research around reading instruction has shifted. You've probably heard a lot about the science of reading. We just want to make sure that we're current in what our expectations are. So those 2 grade levels are prioritized this year. We of course start with those grade levels because everything needs to be aligned and connected. The other, the content areas that are prioritized this year are health PE, art, and music, because they all got brand new standard language last year from the state, and we just aligned all of that language to be developed into our district level language. That's all refreshed on the website now. It's all uploaded into PowerSchool, but one of the things we need to do is realign all of our rubrics, and you'll see some content areas don't have those rubrics yet because the language is brand new. The group that will have they'll be on sort of their rotation where they have 6 meetings next year, but they will get 2 meetings this year, grade 2 and grade 3, social studies, world language, and student services. And then the group that is going to be on the 3rd year of the rotation, so not next year, but the following year, they will have 6 meetings, but they'll still have their 2 this year. They'll still have their 2 next year, grade 4, grade 5, English language arts, science, and math. You might be thinking, okay, why are some of those core content areas not prioritized until later in this rotation? I also had to match the rotation up by some of the work that happens at the state level, because right now we're on a 5-year rotation of content areas. So social studies is next. Social studies will have new language by the end of this year. Science will have new language by the end of this year, but I'm sort of banking on and hoping that they stick with the national standards. I know that they're going to get a lot of feedback around that. And then the year after that will be the revision for math and ELA. So that's why it sort of looks like a strange progression, and it's core content area heavier later on, but that's by design. So I just threw a lot at you, a lot of writing information, a lot of rubrics, a lot of curriculum work that's going to be happening. But do you guys have questions or clarifications?
Are the rubrics specifically to RSU13, or are they aligned with state standards?
They are, well, this is a really good question. They are aligned to state standards, but they are not always going to match the state language perfectly. And part of that goes back to what the state used to tell us. When we would ask for samples, they would say, oh, we're a local control state. And so, you know, each district, you need to develop your own, you need to do your own thing. And now I use that to our advantage. We are a local control. We need to make agreements together as a district about what do we want this proficiency to look like? What do we want to ensure that students are proficient in order to show mastery? We get to make those decisions. So there's a connection there. We always have a crosswalk. We always have a document that we can look back at to ensure that we're aligned to the main learning results, but we are often pulling from national level standards. And again, part of that just goes back to, we have to have resources. We need to have things that we can use to supplement and anchor our instruction.
No, I like that we're doing that and that we're individualizing it for our region. The follow-up question is, you know, how does that connect to this main state expectations that you were talking about with NUIA? Because if there's a disconnect between what our rubrics are saying in terms of what are important to what the state expectations are, or you said it as a crosswalk, how strong is that crosswalk? And is it maybe it's not necessarily tracking one-to-one to what the NUIA state expectations are?
Well, that wouldn't be applicable in math, because in math it is the Common Core.
Okay.
And our language is the Common Core. It's all crosswalk to the Common Core. English language arts, really the main difference in the main learning results versus the Common Core, it's a little heavier in literature than it is in informational texts. I think our teachers feel very strongly that the informational text piece is really critical. And so I think sometimes those national standards are the next level, the next bar up from when we start shifting things as a state. And then for science, it's next gen science. So there's really no major differences in those three areas.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a good question.
I have a question. So what other states are local states? The way that you describe the curriculum in Maine as a local, like it's
Local control.
Local control. So do we know what other states and how they're, you probably don't. I mean, this is like, I could probably Google it, but I'm curious to know, standing side by side, like other local control states, their standardization test outcomes and how we match up against that as well as national standards. Do you have any idea what are other local control states?
I don't. No, that's a good question. And I guess it's sort of a philosophical question too, local control versus state control. There's pros and cons to both. There's a lot of reasons why I would not want the state to select our curriculum materials. And I know people who have come from states like that, and it has been really tough. But you know, too much local control is not always a good thing either, especially if it lacks support and direction with, you know, what is the best way to do things? What is the best practice? What is the recommendation? And sometimes we don't get those pieces. And, I'm not trying to point a finger at the state, but it does make things really difficult. And probably the best example doesn't really have to do with education itself. It has to do with school safety. We're required to have a school safety plan. And as school safety specialists, we've gone through a training and we've asked for a template for the emergency operations plan. Show us what this can look like. And Maine will not provide one. For that reason, we are a local control state. You guys need to come up with it as a region. But New Hampshire provides one. They have a great template. So local control people, people from local control states can look to other states for resources. But I mean, that's a really good example right there of a level of frustration that districts come up against when we're local control. We've got to make those decisions. Well, everybody having a completely different template to an emergency plan sounds a little problematic to me.
So the rubrics are done by teams, right? You've had teams all along to generate them and now monitor them and update them and with a team leader every time and stuff like that.
Yes. Interestingly, I've got some great leaders for these groups, but I did not get any leaders for the 4 core areas of ELA, science, social studies, or math. So I'm going to be meeting with those groups. I will start all of those 4 content areas off on Wednesday. We'll convene at the Oceanside High School cafeteria. I'll talk with them a little bit about the work, what the vision for the work is. I'll break them into rooms. I thought it was kind of interesting that I did not get leaders for those areas. I don't think it's because we don't have leaders that would be great in those areas. I think it's because we have not dug into this curriculum work since pre-COVID. We haven't had the subs, we haven't had the time, I haven't had the capacity, and I think people have just lost some confidence in their ability to lead and articulate the process. So I need to jumpstart that for the group, and then I think we'll have some leaders in those areas.
This is for the high school?
Middle and high school, grades 6 through 12.
Middle and high.
Yeah.
That's sort of a good segue to the other question I had. If the teachers have time for both vertical and horizontal alignment in the curriculum, in other words, can all the 3rd grade teachers meet and see where there might be alignment between math and science and literature and writing and all that, and sort of time the curriculum to make nice connections? And then likewise, can all the language art teachers meet K through 6 or 6 through 12 and make sure that there's alignment or that there's a nice flow between the different? Is that something that you all have time for?
I've broken it up so it's K through 5. They will all meet in their grade levels. Grades 6 through 12 will meet in their content areas. And then there are certain specialized allied arts that will meet K through 12. So music, art, health, PE, I think that's it. Those 3 are K through 12. World languages 6 through 12. And then all of the other areas are content areas, grades 6 through 12. That's the area that I need to focus my time and energy on the most. We've done a ton of work in K5. And so K5 really just needs some tweaking, but they really miss getting together with their grade levels. We did a ton of work when we were able to pull people out.
That's great, because that's when those rubrics can really be helpful, because then you can start seeing what themes are emerging at different times of the year and maybe align those themes.
Yes.
I don't know, in a previous school, I really encouraged my teachers to just follow one student around from one subject to the next. And it's, if you have 7 periods a day, you're just jumping from one thing to the next. It can be sort of jostling. But if your teachers are able to make connections from what they're learning in one subject to what they're learning in the next, there can be a much more cohesive learning experience for the student.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions or thoughts?
It's great work, a lot of work. And so Wednesday the 18th, yeah.
Yeah.
This Wednesday. Yeah, okay.
So any
Must be
suggestions?
good to be able to get back to this stuff, right? Because COVID just, I don't know, just
Well,
paused and survival.
well, when I think back on COVID and I think about my role, I honestly, it makes me feel a little emotional because I have nothing to show for any of that work. For contact tracing, all the hours that I spent contact tracing, writing protocols, writing a reopening plan. I mean, 3 years later, yeah, we survived through it. I think our district did a wonderful job. But in terms of my work, I don't have anything to show for that. And it's a little embarrassing to say we haven't done some of this since pre-COVID. You can only say that to teachers so many times before it's okay. We
But you
got to.
we do have things to show for it, as in the safety of our staff and students.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's just like you just gotta just cleave it out in your head. It's a separate, completely separate chunk of time for you personally and your family and your job.
Yeah.
Don't feel badly. That's not fair to you, like at all. Like at all.
As a curriculum person, though, I feel this huge sense of guilt, like, oh my gosh, we gotta really get back to this stuff. But it is important in terms of student engagement as well. We've got to make sure that we're in line. We've got to make sure that things make sense for the kids and really just get back to the roots of what we were doing pre-COVID, which is clear expectations, effective feedback, and then, having students set goals about where are they now and what are their next steps, and just really getting back to some of those core pieces that, I think it's when you're in survival mode and teachers have been in survival mode, you're just trying to get through the best that you can. I think our teachers have done a tremendous job as well, but we still have our work cut out for us.
Yeah, I would echo what, sorry, I would just echo what you said, Lauren. Stephanie, you should not feel guilty about that. I can sympathize because I think that as educators, we want to catch up. We want to make up for that lost ground.
Yeah.
And I think you're doing everything that you possibly can to do that. So we really appreciate that. And I just think that you have to sort of understand that it's going to take time to get back up to speed with, particularly those third graders who missed that whole year, and all those people. We're seeing the ripple effect of that. But it's going to take time, and I think what you're doing here with the rubrics is a really important step in that direction.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Appreciate hearing that.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
So next meeting, if we're meeting the third Monday in November, it looks like it's the 20th.
Yeah, November 20th is on my calendar.
Okay, perfect. And then any thoughts from this group about how we did things last year with having like a specific lens at each meeting, or any ideas from the group going forward? Before Brad and I will get together, but I just wanted other people to chime in if you had any thoughts in advance of Brad and I meeting.
Well, not surprisingly, I do want to see our continued focus on relationships when need be, like quite a lot. So everything else is just great. Yeah. I think that, go ahead.
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I will certainly reach out if that shifts. Yeah. I mean, I'm curious if we ever dive into actual curriculum, like, hey, this is like, for example, you're looking at the PE health curriculum this year. And so I'd be curious how, as a committee, we might be in like giving feedback to that curriculum to expand it or shift it around in some way, if that's part of our role. So that might be something. But otherwise, yeah, I can't think of anything.
One thing I typically share with this group too is when we are doing a more intensive review of a particular area, and we do have one going on this year. It's an extension of last year, and it's the K-5 literacy. So we have a new group. They'll actually be meeting Wednesday at 3:30. Jenny West is she's in sort of a new role this year, but she has been an interventionist in Title I. She's got a tremendous background in literacy instruction. And she is leading that group right now. Just we needed to shift the model just a little bit and get more teacher voices at the table to really think about understanding the science of reading research, what that means for instruction, what we might need for professional development, and what resources are out there around those pieces. And we have some really great pockets right now within the district of teachers that are trying some new things. So we're calling this like a lab year. It's like a research year where they're getting to try out some different materials and approaches. And then we'll look at what they're finding, and we'll continue our process after that. We're kind of in flux because we're either going to pilot in January or we're going to make some decisions closer to the end of the year. It sort of depends on how the meeting goes on Wednesday. We want teachers to help drive those decisions, but one of the things that we brought up is we've already got some great things happening that we could start tracking data on. And then maybe introduce just one other thing to the mix and then study what might be the best step going forward. So that could also be an area that we want to continue to get updates on, and you guys could weigh in on.
So
Is that all grade levels?
K through 5.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is sort of giving up on the Lucy Calkins balanced literacy and going more toward the science of learning or science of reading. Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah.
Yes, and we didn't have, well, we had Lucy Calkins many years ago, probably 7 years ago. And then we shifted to Reading Street. Okay. Reading Street did not receive the best Ed Reports review, which Ed Reports, it looks at some of the standard alignment, but we continued to use it because it was something that was purchased as I was starting this work. And, you know, we shared it with the board. It had some digital access to it as well, which was very helpful during COVID, but the digital access has been, we no longer have that level of access because the company, which is like a Pearson Savis company, they no longer provide the program. You can't buy the books anymore. You can't use the digital access. And that was 1 year less than our 6-year implementation plan. So that's another really good example of some of those things that happened during COVID is this lack of resources. You have to scramble and figure out what are you going to use next. I think districts are lucky to have the ESSER money to fall back on to make some of these curriculum changes, but that has been pretty intense.
So does that mean that Reading Street turned into like a reading cul-de-sac with that curriculum? So I had to.
Yes.
Shameless.
I think that's a really good way to put it. Yeah. All right. Well,
yeah, you know, like, have you guys heard that famous podcast about Lucy Calkins, etc.?
The one on the Daily. The Daily did one on. The New York Times Daily did one on her that was just damning.
Oh God, it's just terrifying what's happened there.
I feel very sad for her. She's obviously was very well intentioned when she developed all of that curriculum, but many of our teachers have read or have listened to the Sold a Story podcast, and we had a couple schools even do a pod study where they were listening to the podcast and they would come in and discuss it and talk about strategies. But it's really fascinating because when I don't have a K-5 literacy background. I was a high school English teacher. But the teachers were really, they were really well versed in their literacy instruction 6 years ago when we were developing rubrics, and we're pretty adamant about what the rubrics should represent and, how do we look at reading levels. And a lot of it was based on practices that really aren't being recommended anymore. But, different schools of thought around that. The school of thought has shifted, and I think our teachers are ready to shift in a new direction as well.
Yeah. My experience in this, and I've seen these trends, the pendulum swing pretty far toward Lucy a while ago. Now it's swinging pretty far in the other direction. I think my prediction 5 years from now, it's not going to go back toward Lucy, but it's going to go back a little bit towards some of the balanced literacy ideas. It's not going to be pure balanced literacy, but I would say that tapping into individual interests and giving students a little bit more voice and choice and autonomy in what they learn, and really focusing on some of those things where they can discover what reading is and why it's important to them. I think that's going to be, I think the pendulum's going to swing back a little bit in that direction.
Yeah.
I
And-
really hope it does, Brad, because I would argue that really activates a student's motivation to learn and look at, areas and actually be successful and find, topics and genre that they can be successful in too. I did an awful lot of that in my teaching. And I think, when there's a change in administration in Augusta, you'll have really cool initiatives like that, and then you'll have something as horrible as the local assessment system, which was a total and complete waste of time and an utter disaster for the whole state. So it just kind of depends on who's at the helm up there in Augusta. So,
well, and that's a good argument for having local control, right? So if you have some teachers having input and they can see the virtue of both sides of both ends of the spectrum, and come up with something that's maybe a little bit in between, maybe more toward the science of learning or wherever it may be, then I think we could have a winning formula for the students that we serve.
yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And I think our teachers are really cautious. The science of reading is really about directed phonics instruction and really making sure that the instruction is intentional and clear in those very early grades. And that's not going to work in grades 3, 4, and 5. Maybe even, in grade 2, you only need it to a certain extent. Once kids have those skills, then you're developing the love of reading. And we tried bookworms last year to varying degrees of success. We do have teachers who are still using that. We're going to start looking at some of their assessment data. But the bookworms, one of the things that we loved about that is by 5th grade, kids will have read 250 books, actual books, not an anthology, not a big box, 250 books. So, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
I have to go.
All right. Well, I think we can probably close the meeting. And Brad, we can email and figure out a good time to get together and plan.
Yeah,
Also,
feel free
just
to
a
suggest a
topic.
time, Stephanie. Anytime that's good for you.
Perfect.
Topic for us to look at is like teacher well-being and burnout, and there's post-COVID now, there's like staff shortages, and I'm just curious to get an update and talk about how they're doing within all that. Not today, but in the future too.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yep. See ya. See ya.
Have a good rest of the day. Hey, before you go, ask Rita if there's a time that you'd like to get together at some point. We can try to get together. That's good for you. You there? You there? Okay, we'll catch up. You might be frozen.